now that the SSD and hard drive market are completely sold out for the next 2 years, like the only option to get more supply is through circularity. And so now we're not just like, oh, cool, it's a sustainability checklist thing. Like it's no, you like there is no other option. So I think people are going to be listening a lot more, and so we have a great opportunity to go basically create a narrative around why it's important now and more important than ever. And we have a tremendous amount of economic leverage right now to go apply this to the industry. So
John Michael, can you tell us, what companies you're affiliated with right now, and a little bit of,
which
like
which
why you're an expert, panelist?
Yes. So I spent 10 years at Intel as the SSD product line manager and strategic planner and everything all the way back from a validation engineer when I first started working on Intel SSDs. I left in 2021 and went to a company called Chia. And at Chia, I worked a lot on hard drives. Seagate and WD and Micron were my top customers. And that was sort of the origin of like how CDI started. We're like, hey, why is everybody shredding all these drives? That's stupid. And I'm like, don't they know about that you can just sanitize the drive and reuse it? And they're like, it's way more complicated than that. I'm like, I don't think so, but okay, Um, but through that was a fun process, learning a bunch of talking the developers and learning the hard drive world. And unfortunately, I know lots more about hard drives than I would like to, for instance now. But and yeah, recently, for the last 2 years, I have a company called Farm GPU. I'm the CEO, and we're a neocloud based out of Northern California, running AI compute. We do lots of AI and storage stuff. Solidigm is one of our big partners, and I'm advisor and partner with Solidigm on all things AI and storage. So,
Nice. Okay, great. Thank you. Brad, could you maybe introduce yourself and your background?
Yeah, so I'm Brad Gasworth. I'm the Global Head of Research and Market Intelligence at Circular. A little bit of a different background. I came from Wall Street, spent 20 years plus advising some of the world's largest mutual funds and hedge funds. Covered the component supply chain for a very long time and very excited for today's topic. I think there's a lot that could offer and hopefully have a different perspective here.
Yeah, thank you. And then Jeff, how about yourself?
Hi, I'm Jeff Harper. I've been in the industry for quite a while, selling electronic components. I worked for 20 years at Mitsubishi, and then after that, 20 years at Samsung. Actually delivered the first SSD that was ever HP ever looked at, and back when they were $2 a gigabyte. So with
at this rate, we'll be back there soon, Jeff.
yeah. So
Yeah.
it's been very interesting in watching this market, especially now. I think the key thing is what you've been doing, what you're looking at doing is an absolute necessity right now, trying to do that because you're right. This is the shortest market that we've ever seen, and it's only going to get worse.
Well, let's dive in then. So, I mean, we've seen, all the news reports. I mean, in our day-to-day, interactions with suppliers and customers as well, everyone knows there's a shortage. The reports are saying that the AI industry is eating up approximately 70% of all memory. How's this AI tax specifically affecting the SSD market? What do you guys think about that?
I can jump in. I think first AI is going to continuously take a significant portion. I mean, the Pandora's box is opened and it's not going to slow down anytime soon. I think what is going to potentially happen is these smaller tier players are going to be left out of the situation and they're going to have to pay higher prices and margins go down and then they're going to be really squeezed from an operations perspective. But I think, again, I don't see how AI adoption slows down. So I don't see how you don't have this problem for, at least another 2 years from now, at least one more. I can't see, 12 to 24 months. I don't see how that's possible. But, that's my perspective. I just see it getting really bad for little people.
JM?
I got a few sound bites. It's funny when I was at Intel and like we were even at Chia. Like I used to read all these like all the IDC market analysis reports and the SSD TAM and the different market segments, and they would interview me as an expert of like, okay, who are you selling to, which Microsoft and Oracle and Dell, and what kind of drives are they using, and TLC and QLC and form factor and all that stuff. But it's funny because like all these reports are now wrong because the market moves so fast. Like I was just looking at the TrendForce data that they just on I did a little AI research this morning just to give some numbers for the call here today, but like the Q3 25 revenue for all the enterprise SSD suppliers was $6.5 billion. In Q4 of 25, that jumped to 21 billion. And the Celadon guys gave me a couple sound bites, which was like the enterprise SSD demand in 2026 is jumping, 70%. Um, and the NAND supply only increased by 16%. And so the dollar per gigabyte, and increase in the ASP of the drives, it was projected to go 160%. That is, I mean, anybody who's been in the SSD market or hard drive, like that is unprecedented. Like nothing like this has ever happened. Like 160% year-over-year increase is like not something that happens. Like it's just not. So and the AI, if I, like it's very clear that this is not like just going to get better in 27, right? Like it's as you mentioned, the memory thing, just the demand is insatiable. Everybody, the CapEx build out is going to continue. There's no indication that for instance, we'll get to some point that it's like, oh yeah, the AI is just smart enough. We can run it on a phone. We'll you don't need these big data centers, right? They're always going to have that next smarter model that's going to be able to run in there, and they're all going to automate, all this stuff, which hopefully we'll all see I have obviously lots of opinions on on that and how it'll affect society and stuff, but that's not the conversation today. But yeah, so it's
Well,
not slow. Yeah, just it is definitely not slowing down. If anything, we hear like um, all I heard from talking to the experts on the market side was lots of uncertainty.
yeah.
Like we don't know. Like we have no idea. Like we have no idea what's going to happen in 27.
So I mean, we've seen pricing triple, quadruple. Direct pricing is what we're talking about, and then of course we know that many users are going to the open market, and so now that multiplier is even greater. Do you guys think that we're close to the peak? Are we at the peak? How much room does it have to grow, or are we going to start to see a decline here?
I don't think we're near the peak right now at all. I mean, first you have to have more capacity, more supply to get prices lower. In 2026, we all know there's not more capacity coming. So, to me, I don't see how prices don't go up every quarter. The question is at what magnitude? If you look at Q1 from Q4, I mean, it was depending on what source, you're looking 50% to 100% increase in DRAM. And then you're looking at like spot pricing being, 2x of where that contract pricing is. So I don't see a scenario of DRAM Q2 being less than 30 to 50% up. So, I think it's going to continue to be in this magnitude. I don't see what derails it unless you have some major macro event that's really like takes off global demand, which again, I don't even think that's plausible.
We're constantly buying, right? We're a cloud. We're buying servers, we're buying SSDs, we're buying DRAM, we're buying GPUs. And just on one of the storage servers that we bought for like our vast data cluster, we bought some in like December, and the price of that server versus we just got a quote for like the same refresh version of that same server is 2.6x. This is without the SSDs, just the components of like the CPU and the DRAM and the server. So 2.6x in 3 months, right, on a server, a pure server cost. And then we just said like, oh well, the SSD cost has gone up like almost in some cases 2 to 3x depending on the market segment in just that same time. I had one of our supplier partners, one of our come in here in the office, and they're like, I can't. I got a quote from one of the OEMs, and I can't even give it to the customer because it's so astronomically high. It's like it's so embarrassing that I can't even give it to the customer. At least what I mentioned is it's very clear that 2026 and 2027 are going to be completely sold out. And so now I think we have some good opportunity to kind of think about what could we do, for instance, that we have now this beautiful and great knowledge and all the hard work we've been doing on circularity for the last since 2021, and a lot of other folks for a lot longer than I have. How do we now like extend that knowledge and let other people understand like how that impacts these broader industries?
OEM contract pricing hasn't even been closed yet for second quarter, and most of the suppliers are not really even putting out pricing. But it has been announced by at least two suppliers that they anticipate 100% increase for quarter over quarter.
So that's interesting. I mean, so if everything is fully allocated, how are companies, like JM, I mean, how are companies like your tier two, tier three data center AI infrastructure type companies, How are you getting drives? What's that look like for
Uh,
for anybody that's not, a hyperscaler?
Yeah, I mean we're in a very special spot because Celanime is one of our partners, but so I guess we kind of cheat there. But
Well, that's good.
yeah,
But
that's
yeah,
good.
but the typical, I mean,
Yeah,
how do what do you think they're doing?
if say for instance, you're we have like, some of these customers, partners that want to have a certain amount of SD capacity for like a GPU deal or something, right? And if they're like, oh, I want 40 petabytes, if you go to one of these larger SSD vendors right now, they're going to say like, great, you'll get it in Q2 of 27. No, I need it like right now. Like the deployment's like next month. Like what are you talking about, right? Uh, yeah, all I can say is I can imagine the supply chain constraints are very real. Now, one of the unique things, I'll talk about, just my perception on the hard drive market. I'm very curious to hear, Brad, your opinion on this and stuff too, where I think something like 92% of the HDD market goes to hyperscalers right now, like the demand, and it's probably more than that, to be honest. Like if like if you think about like what are these guys doing with it, we know what they're doing. They're selling it on, Amazon selling it on S3 and Microsoft selling it on Blob Store. They're turning around and literally buying a thing and then renting it out on their cloud and then generating revenue every month from that thing. That is what a cloud does. And so that's tremendously profitable for them. And so of course they're going to just buy it all. So what, some folks for backup and some bigger deployments are kind of forced into these scenarios where like there is no other option. Like if you want to deploy a certain amount of capacity in a very short amount of time, and the cloud sort of has this monopoly on that. Yeah, not every neo cloud like us has like extensive storage background that can go figure out how to source these right components and put together these custom bombs or get understand the used SSD market, right? How do we look at people are we're not scared of buying drives and updating firmware and by the way, like this is something that I think we had maybe I discussed at CDI earlier. Like we have relationships with all the SSD vendors, and like CDI should absolutely be helping people when they buy used drives. Like, how do you make the best out of those used drives? Well, SSDs don't fail typically because of hardware. Or early SSDs, the majority of failures were because of firmware failures. So how do we educate people on like recovering drives from firmware failures so that you don't just have to throw the drive out and shred it, but like it can actually be recovered? How do we work with again, a lot of these SSD vendors, like just quite frankly, didn't have time for circularity and refurbish programs. They're like, we just don't care. It's 3% of our business. It's just not, it's like annoying and make it go away, please. And now all of a sudden, like that conversation can change when, no, like you guys need to help these people that bought used drives. Like, how do you get them back into a production level quality state? How do you, like the stuff where I mentioned CDI is building to understand the health and reliability of used drives? Like that is really important, right? How do you tell people that they can use stuff and with high confidence, and how do you deploy that in production, right?
No, I think you guys actually, just doing my due diligence before this panel, I think you guys do have a unique opportunity here with that. I mean, you hit on the head there, Jam. I think it's, right now with everything going on, I think CDI has a lot of sort of momentum where it could be, valuable to the market. But the one thing, Parker, I wanted to mention also that on the NAND market and SSDs, the one thing we haven't talked about yet is the gross margins that if you look at Samsung and Hynix and Micron, they get such high gross margins from HBM, like almost 80% now. So if you look at, what we've seen in the past when we went through overexpansion, you've gone through when, these companies acted a little rogue and they went sort of Wild West. With DRAM margins where they are, I don't see them shifting more to NAND just given the pricing. So, if I look at anything, I think the SSD market in the next year is going to be even tighter because there's just not, there's not a reason for them to shift capacity to NAND. And then you also have the other wild card of like smartphone demand is down a lot. PC demand is down a lot. Now, AI is taking a significant portion of that away. But it's, I think the economics behooves these memory companies to stay on, places that they get the highest gross margin, and that sort of leaves SSDs to go higher because of, lack of supply.
I mean, so with that being said, I mean, and that's widely known, right? I mean that HBM is gobbling up the capacity. Are there alternatives to SSDs? I mean, can you go to HDDs, hard disk drives, as a potential safety valve for, not getting the SSD capacity?
Yeah.
For me, I find it funny that we're saying, can we go to HDDs from SSDs when, for years it was the other way around, right? It was, could you go to SSDs from HDDs? I think, this all started, mostly, I mean, obviously you get higher capacities on SSDs, but it started with a drive shortage, right? Like that was the initial impact was HDDs were allocated for 2 years and we needed more, other ways. And then you have this surprise in January by NVIDIA with Vera Rubin adding another 15 terabyte SKU with its, reference design, and I'm sure, Jay, and we've talked to your partner, Solidigm, but they'll tell you that reference design alone will increase demand by 45%. So, I mean, you have like these things that are happening that, I don't, is there an alternative? People are going to try and find one. I mean, ultimately, is there one right now? No.
You said hard drive market's also, to get WD stocks doing pretty good. Hard drives are in high demand, and I mean I told you guys my theory on it's pretty simple knowing where they're going, like why that demand is high, because they're off going and generating revenue off those hard drives. But yeah, there's other, I just talked to the CEO of Backblaze last week about where we're potentially, going to be offering one of their managed services for hard drives with our data center. And I guess Parker, that's actually kind of a good answer to your earlier question of like, what are you guys doing when you can't get supply? Well, like we have partnerships. Like they're like, well, we have 5 exabytes or whatever, and we have our managed service like for NeoClouds we can roll out. And how do we integrate that into our platform so customers can back up stuff? And I don't want to be hosting a bunch of hard drives. Like I already have enough PTSD from hard drives. Like let's host them in their data centers. They're really good at this stuff.
See, do you think like that blended approach is a pretty, like pretty common strategy?
Yeah, like if somebody's, before, like when you're making these business arrangements of like, say for instance, like revenue shares or supply agreements or something like that. If there's a not constrained market, then those are like trickier conversations. Like, well, I can just buy the thing and then I can host it myself, and that's the TCO. But when you're like, oh no, there is no supply, that completely changes the dynamic of these business conversations about how you do creative business models for people that do have the supply and people that don't. And again, the cloud providers are 3 or 4 steps ahead on this by buying all this stuff.
But so like with Samsung and Micron adding new capacity, supposedly by the end of this year, I mean, is any of that going to make it into the market, or do you think it'll all be claimed? Is it already claimed?
I think it takes a few years to ramp up. One of those scenarios, like I mentioned, just the bit growth this year was 16 for 25 to 26, 16%. It's not like that like triples in 27. It goes up by another like 10% or something, right? Which is a big, like traditionally the bit growth of the industry, like 27% or something is like pretty big, right? Like a little risky of like you don't want to, like you said, grow the supply, faster than the demand, or else you risk just completely like all the SSD vendors all have trauma from the last crash. That was like a lot of these guys almost went out of business and we're losing $1 billion of operating margin a quarter. And they're like, why would we do that again? That's stupid. We should like, yeah, let's not do that. That was very unfun. So I do think that people are going to be careful. I think what you just mentioned on Brad, which is if there's, it's very clear if there's CapEx that goes into a fab and HBM and memory deliver a higher margin, then why on earth would they build NAND? Unless you're somebody like Kioxia who doesn't have memory, who just has NAND. Well, all you can build is NAND because that's all you know how to build. Uh, but for these guys that have the choice, and they're traditionally these are not like the lower guys. These are the number one and two suppliers of SSDs, Samsung and SK Hynix, right? Like, and like if they're going to be, yeah, like if they're going to decide to not build more capacity, then that's going to be a huge problem. And and these shortages will last a lot longer than 2 years.
I mean,
Samsung is definitely putting out capex and trying to increase their NAND supply. One of the big challenges they all face is the concern of is this a bubble or is it a sustained thing? I mean, they've got customers going in trying to offer them 3 year, unheard of 3 year agreements, trying to buy additional capacity. And the big concern is if they really do that, will the demand be continued?
I mean, how do you think that they'll respond to that? How are they responding to that? What are your observations? I mean, are they, um, are they ramping up for that,
They're,
3-year commitment, so to speak?
they're responding cautiously. I mean, you can have all the NCNR agreements in place, but when if a customer's demand falls off and they don't want the parts, that they'll break that agreement. They are ramping, and there is additional capex going in play. But it takes at least 6 months once that capex goes into play to start driving increases.
And then, Parker, to that original question about like 26 extra extra capacity coming on, if you talk to these, the largest manufacturers here, and you talk to them about like what they're seeing from a demand perspective, having these conversations, they'll tell you like last week they got X, this week and now it's 2X, and like they're getting, almost doubling and tripling a forecast like on a weekly basis. So like, it seems like even these, larger players are really missing out on their demand, forecasting. So I think it's fully allocated. I think there's already, I think 2026 is fully, allocated in SSDs and DRAM, HBM across the board. And I think the question is, first half of next year, I think is also in the same situation. Second half it's a sort of a debate, how much can come on, how quick. But for my expectation is I still think next year will be quite tight, especially now with if you look at SSDs, I think we've all made good points. They're a lot more cautious than they were in the past, and they get higher gross margin if they're one that, if they do other stuff as well. So I think it's going to be another 24 months before we see, a little bit of a loosening.
I mean, with that in mind, then, I mean, let's talk a little bit more about unconventional strategies to, secure material. I mean, we've already, kind of touched on it a little bit, but I mean, how does the market really, take advantage of used product? What would be a good strategy for someone to, incorporate this strategy into their supply chain?
I mean, the easiest thing is coming to circular technology. No, but no, it's the right question. Honestly, this is one of the considerations why I joined Circular. Quite honestly, like I came from Wall Street, advising hedge funds and mutual funds in technology strategy, and I saw, a friend of mine who started Circular, and I thought, this time it's sort of brilliant timing because when I spend my time in the supply chain and I talk to these component companies, if it's packaging, substrate, materials, tooling. Everything is tight. And I don't see what shifts. And I still think we're like inning one of AI. So, until we get AGI or ASI, everybody's going to spend like madmen. And until that, when we get, super intelligence, then CapEx might come down. But I don't think it slows down until super intelligence is achieved, quite honestly. That's sort of my big view. And I think, if that view is right, then we're going to be tight in this, high spend period for at least 3 more years, in my opinion.
As you mentioned, like, this, like, not outside the traditional new going through disties who have these partnerships with the OEMs and the SSD companies directly where, they're getting like, channel, like what I heard from the SSD vendors is like the channel drives that, go out through the traditional channel partners and disties is zero.
Mhm.
Like they're like, no. Like every deal is a named account and a known thing, right? Like there's no reason why they would need to like just distribute SSDs into the channel and be like, good luck, for reselling these. But for all the companies, I know a big chunk of companies, they're part of CDI that are in this world of reselling, right? One of the things we were trying to do as part of the CDI spec for the drives and the health grading and stuff was like, I was sick of looking at these Excel spreadsheets with like no details. Like, here's a list of drives and the serial numbers. And I'm like, okay, like, you sort of like, are they the correct model string? Like, did they pull these correctly? Like, no health information, no like power on hours, like smart tests, grading, no firmware version, like because a big chunk of times they'll get a bunch of drives and they'll have like an OEM firmware that can't be updated because it's like locked, like just stupid stuff where like I mean we know how to get around them because we're SSD experts, like we can go figure out how to navigate around these issues, right? But like the average buyer is not going to know like, oh, how do I update, like, oh, these have a Dell firmware and like oh, I need to go to like Dell's website and put them in an iDRAC machine to update them. I can't just like go to find the firmware at these vendors. And I know just I'll just pick on Samsung because I don't think they do a good job at this. Like, right, there's no public repository for firmware updates, and because they're not in the group right now, I can poke at them. But they don't have a public repository for firmware updates. You have to like email an FAE or an account manager or somebody who knows, somebody somebody on the inside to give you firmware. And I know the companies like Kioxia and Japanese companies are like very conservative. They don't just like post the firmware randomly on a website. They're like super secure. So getting these are extremely challenging unless you're on the inside like us. So like I can call a guy at Kioxia and be like, yeah, give me the firmware. But then it's really challenging. It's really hard to get this stuff. But I think this is where just where again like where people are seeing issues and maybe like how CDI could help. Like that's what we're here to do is help people. Like here's how to source. Here's how to like responsibly source used drives. Here's what to look for. Here's how to use our tools. And here's some partners that have their own software suites that are great. Like use these to to do this screen on your drives first. So again, going through like pre-AI, going through a list of like 3,000 drives in health was like not possible. Now I just pop it in one prompt and say, give me a summary of these drives. It'll be like, yep, there's 5 drives that are failed. Here's the reason,
So,
there's
so
not,
Jim,
yeah.
would you say that like the ability to perform firmware updates is the largest obstacle a company would have
I would
in
say we
using?
have bought a tremendous amount of used drives and not a single one has ever had the latest firmware.
Okay.
Ever. 0%. So, that tells me that nobody cares. They just don't know that, hey, the number one thing you can do to increase SSD and hard drive reliability is to actually upgrade the firmware because they have teams of thousands of engineers working on the firmware updates to make them more stable, especially for the high volume drives that go into hyperscalers that are like the, millions of units, volume. Yeah, they spend a lot of time between firmware version 1 and firmware version 10, that's 2 years later. And like, if you're going to run that drive for 10 years, you want that one that they finished on, right? Like not the first one. And I don't think consumers even know where to look. Like, I only know where to look because, like I said, I used to work at an SSD company, right? So, yeah, I think that there's a tremendous amount of help that we can, like through our partnerships with these guys directly, can help consumers. But yeah,
And
I'm excited about some of that tech we built that we can potentially share.
the big challenge for the suppliers on firmware updates is twofold. Once, most when they get designed in, they're designed in under a certain firmware. Even a generic drive has a specific firmware. And if they change that firmware, quite often there are problems. So there's even customers who will actually, when they buy, will request an outdated or an older SSD firmware
Oh no, it's so painful.
because I mean it's I've seen it
Yeah.
firsthand where you go and update the firmware and you don't tell the customer that it's updated because it's a generic firmware, and suddenly you're hauled in for all kinds of quality problems because it doesn't match up with the way they set it up.
Yeah, it's funny. As you say that, I remember like I think that people think that SSD firmware is like it was 10 years ago, right?
Mm.
SSDs were a lot newer, right? It was a very different world back then where, yeah, like you'd have this golden firmware image and like, don't touch it, everything works. Like, don't update anything. And you don't have to be like, oh, we're going to update 1,000 drives. Like, okay, we'll update one system, run it for a couple months. It works great. No issues. We'll update the rest. There's very practical things you can do to like get around that stuff, but like, no, Jeff, what you said, like a lot that is ingrained in so many data center operators' heads of just like, nope, we have a stable version, don't fix anything. We'll just say like one of the largest ISV software partners that's worth tens of billions of dollars now. We like looked under the hood of their software and like they're using this ancient Linux kernel. And like only we would have figured that out because we like dug down and like looked at it. We're like, what are you doing? But I put it together instantly. They're like, they have this stack that works, and they're like, we're just going to build a bunch of value on top of that stack, for end user applications and different workloads. And like, why would we ever touch the thing that works? Like, don't touch that. Don't break that. Like just leave that alone. So I get that. But at the same time, like SSD firmware is not what it was 10 years ago. Like it's the reliability and update cycle and everything is like very, very different.
And I mean, the other angle too is for whatever reason, a lot of the quality engineers at the suppliers, they don't feel comfortable that anybody can update that firmware but them. And so that's a really big issue that I worked for years to try to get around because there's not only would being able to update the firmware help with a circular initiative, but it would also be very good for the customers because they could buy buy a base product and be able to update the firmware, and that would at the end of the deal versus the beginning of the production, and that would allow them all kinds of forecast flexibility.
Yeah, and Parker and Brad, and you guys sell to to customers that are buying used drives. Do you have like a list of like common exceptions or concerns or things that for instance, we could alleviate by with some knowledge dropping?
Yeah, some additional things are, I mean, what is what's the life going to be? I mean,
Mhm.
if a drive's already, run for 3, 4, 5 years, how much longer will it last? And what are your comments on that, JM?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So if folks don't know, we've kind of written about this extensively at CDI, and the way that reliability engineers think about failures is not like how long will this thing last? It is like what is the annual failure rate of this thing? So you have a population of drives. When you say 2 million hour MTBF, doesn't mean if you run one drive for 2 million hours it will instantly fail. That means like over a sample size of thousands of drives, they ran them for thousands of hours, and every on average every 2 million hours of drive hours total there was a failure. And that's how, and I even got asked this for hard drives. They said, hey, like if I run the drives cooler, if I run them in, with like less wear and tear, like less workload, like will they be more reliable? Well, I understand how hard drives work. They're a mechanical device, and there's a head and it's spinning, and the head goes on and off, and for writing data. And the more times you do that, the more on and off cycles, the more data that's written, there's more mechanical wear and tear, and there's having talked to the folks at WD and Seagate, like it's very understood like why hard drives fail. There's a little particle gets off and it scratches the platter, and then you get uncorrectables, and you'll get reallocated sectors. At a certain point, like if a particle is loose and just causing chaos, like they'll have to take that whole platter offline. And there's some of the hyperscalers are doing more advanced stuff like that. Like we know exactly how these things fail. One thing people would take away, and something we've written about, like SSDs and hard drives are like totally different types of devices in that world. Like yes, they're both storage devices, but they fail. One of them is mechanical in nature for the failures. One of them is, there are like actual physical failures and components that happen, but like they fail for SSDs fail for completely different reasons than hard drives for one. And two, you could project out like, okay, well, I have this population of drives and the average power and hours is this, and the health average writes are this. Like endurance is very simple. Like we know how to predict that and know how much you're writing and when an SSD will fail. Like that's very simple stuff that any SSD technologist can tell you. Like I know exactly when this will fail based on how much data you're writing to it. If it's just in a steady state, like, well, we have a lot of data from like hyperscalers that have been running these drives for like over 10 years and no problems. Like, and if they're still generating revenue, like they're not gonna turn them off. Yeah, intrinsically, like, you can answer that question a lot of ways. Like my technical hat on, I would say, yeah, like it's not, we have a known reliability, and the way to demonstrate reliability is to do a reliability demonstration test. When SSD and hard drive vendors write a spec sheet, that is how they determine that number. It's not made up. They actually have 1,000 drives or 1,000 hours, and then they do a statistical Pareto and analysis of like, here's what the failure rate is. And that's the same thing they do with an iPad and a phone and stuff. So they know you're not going to like these things are not just going to like randomly fail. That's called quality engineering, and I worked very closely with Intel on that. But that's like how I'd actually answer it. But like in practical, people just want to know that number, Parker. Is it going to be 10 years? Is it like 12 years? Like we could probably give them some like realistic, we could probably give them some estimate, right? And we've been debating that in the software tool. Like, do we just make up a number to like make people happy, right? That like is based off some kind of like projection, right?
Have you been able to solve the customers' concerns about sanitizing the drives? I mean,
We've only been
to
working on
me,
it.
that
We've
was
only been
always the
working on it
single
for
biggest
five
issue,
five years
right?
straight. We had to write a few specs to get there. But
I
I would say
mean,
I would say it's much better than it was in 2021. I could tell you that much.
that's that's always been the biggest issue for being able to repurpose drives is, in my in my experience, is just getting the customer to let you have the drive and sanitize it and believe that it's been sanitized. I mean, is that still an issue or?
It absolutely is still the number one barrier to circularity is
Number one
storage.
barrier, right?
Yeah. We've tried to do as much education as possible about, and that was I mentioned that, the policy we just released, which was like, how do you, adopt a company policy around media sanitization and reuse that's based on the latest industry standard specs. And even NIST 888 has been now updated to point to IEEE 2883. And that was one of the biggest points of confusion. And people are like, well, like we adopt NIST. And even though IEEE 283 came out in 2022. They're like, well, we just use NIST. We're like, no, that the spec, the guys who wrote that spec wrote the other one, and they said that one's not right anymore. They're like, well, that's great. You should tell NIST that. And it took 5 years to do that, right? To NIST to like assign a person on that and to do it. And like, but oh God, like, so yeah, it's getting better, but you will say that, hyperscalers are still not there yet, right? Where their compliance people are like, okay, is it worth it to, generate and, recoup X $100 million of capital on selling you stuff versus like, a drive ending up on eBay with customer data and your entire reputation. Well, a hyperscaler's entire business model is based on trust. When you put your data in the cloud, you're fairly sure that it's going to be there when you come back. It's called durability. And you're fairly sure they're not going to steal your data. That's called privacy. So, like, the last thing in the world they want is like a privacy disaster. Like, they do not want that at any cost. And they
I
will,
agree.
and what they've done traditionally is just shred every drive to make sure that is never that's never breached. And I think that that's an unreasonable, completely unreasonable response.
You and me both.
And so, yeah,
There's
we're
there's
fighting
a
we're
lot
fighting the good fight here.
there's a lot of customers sitting there with 30, 60 terabyte drives that they bought for what, 6 cents a gigabyte. We could turn around and sell them for 20 cents a gigabyte if they just trusted the sanitization process.
It was refreshing to hear, like, we had Dell come into the work group and present kind of their policy when somebody returns a Dell system. Yeah, they send it back to the factory, they run the sanitization and they run the verification, and then they resell it as a recertified drive. Like, it's a
Mhm.
totally reasonable thing to do. Yes, like, we're like, thank you. That's like, please, like, why can't everybody else just do that?
Well, guys, we're running short on time here, so I've got one last question for you, and this is a fun one. If you were a chief procurement officer with a fixed budget in 2026, would you buy your remaining storage needs today at a premium, or would you wait to see if the price will go lower by the end of the year?
I mean, I can kick it off since we're all silent. I mean, I think
Yeah,
you
go
already
go
know
for it,
my
Brad.
answer. I think it behooves anybody to be purchasing now. I just think there's too much risk of continued shortages and higher prices. And, again, I spend a lot of time with, each of these subcomponents, if it's packaging or materials. And, because of shortages there, you might actually have more bottlenecks to have even shorter supply. So I just see prices going higher, 'cause supply remaining tight, and then demand improving. So I would be buying right now.
I mentioned that one of the problems is always getting capital and stuff, which is again why the cloud is so attractive, right? You don't have to like have a bunch of upfront capital. You can just pay the dollar, dollar per terabyte per month. And yeah, you're paying a premium, but you get on-demand capacity and stuff. And so that's how, I mean, what we're going to be offering services, so we get to kind of benefit from the shortage here a little bit because, thankfully we actually did buy ahead and we're in decent shape for our size of data center, but like, yeah, no other guy, another other folks are not in that same boat. Yeah.
Well, I know one thing for sure, the price isn't going down. So, I mean, it's the problem everybody's going to be looking at is price elasticity. I mean, does the price go up so much that you just can't afford to build it or use it? And or do you just keep paying and
Yeah.
keep building? And that's where we are.
Well, thanks, Brad, Jeff, JM. Appreciate your time.